So good morning and welcome to our study of the excellent path to enlightenment. Chachub Lamsang. As always, kindly generate the intention to kindly generate the intention to apply this in a way so that we can establish all sentient beings at the level of enlightenment. And this is in fact the theme of what we're looking at presently in the context of the ngöndro. We've completed the outer general reflections which really give the perspective why we would want to practice the path to enlightenment, the necessity, if you like, and then the main part of the ngöndro then has 5 parts, and we've covered the first part, which is taking refuge, and we're now in the second part, which is generating the thought of enlightenment, bodhicitta. And by definition, we would say the thought of enlightenment or bodhicitta is the wish to establish all sentient beings on the level of enlightenment. So it's not just that we're pursuing the path from the point of view that we want to get out of samsara, but also we're concerned about others. And so what drives our entire journey is, what motivates our journey is this awareness of the suffering of others, and then really the wish for ourselves to be free of enlightenment is replaced by the concern for everybody. Everybody's suffering. And so bodhicitta is this wish to do something about it. So we say, with this awareness of the others, which we call relative bodhicitta, you could say the absolute nature is beyond any reference point, any dualistic conceptions. But relatively, we do experience ourselves, we do experience others. And relative bodhicitta operates with this awareness of the reality that ourselves and others are situated within. And so there we have 2 aspects, which is, one is the wish to generate or to establish all beings in enlightenment. The other is to actually do it. So whenever we say to cultivate bodhicitta, it's to cultivate this wish, but also with the intention to actually do something about it. So that's where we presently are practicing. We're presently doing something about it with the practice of the ngöndro. So now, the key root to all our suffering is that we're confused. And so, in some ways, sentient beings, they're innocent because they're confused. We're all confused. Nobody's actually really evil. But because of one single misconception, which is taking this vast, open consciousness as being something about me, and identifying consciousness with me, then all the nature of phenomena is perceived through this me. And key in the practice of the path is seeing through this. And when we're developing the motivation of bodhicitta, the thought of enlightenment, really key in this is the magnanimous mind, the big, courageous mind that embraces reality, sees reality for what it is, and that's the aspect of wisdom. And then also the understanding how all the various sentient beings, all the various sentient creatures, all life suffers from this fixating on a self. And when we say all life, we're really just talking about the confused, those who wander in samsara. We'd say there's infinite beings that are free, infinite Buddhas, countless Buddhas. So we're not just saying that the definition of life is to be a sentient being. In fact, we could say this is really just a half-life, and that this half-life, this shadow of this sort of shadow of a life, which is that of a sentient beings, is really a condition of imprisonment where we go through various styles of imprisonment, the realms of samsara. And so the bodhisattva's wish, someone who is on the path, is really to establish all beings, to take them out of this delusion. But we need to ourselves first see what is it in fact that we're suffering from. And that is this uptightness around me. And so we would generally say that relative bodhicitta, compassion for all sentient beings, that's something that's quite easy to do, and absolute bodhicitta is quite difficult in some way to understand, because that is the understanding of wisdom, the absence of these conceptual constructs. It's the nature of shunyata, it's that nature which cannot be grasped by the dualistic mind. On the other hand, especially modern people, because we're philosophically, analytically minded, it's quite helpful for us to first understand what is it we're doing with the Buddhist path. What is this when we say no self? That sounds very strange. And that's really the, if you like, ontological premise. That's the perspective on reality. That's the foundation of the path. So if we were to ask, what are we doing with this nature of enlightenment? And we do that. People discuss. We sit and have coffees and long, meaningful discussions about things, right? So having this kind of mind that reflects and ponders and analyzes, understanding what we're doing with the path is really founded on this insight into lack of self. Lack of self in terms of this consciousness that we have, it's confused when it construes a solid sense of me. And it's also confused when it believes in its projections onto the external world. So this understanding is what we're presently, in the present study, what we're looking at. Now, we might think, well, as educated Westerners, we then should just begin with absolute bodhicitta. But the thing is, absolute bodhicitta, the insight into the reality of things, we can understand that on a level of analysis, with intelligence, and so forth. But in terms of working with the reality of our emotions and our interaction with others, we shouldn't think that relative bodhicitta is insignificant and so forth. It's possibly the most important thing in our present situation, because right now, as much as we could have a philosophical or analytical insight into the nature of reality, as much as we could have that kind of insight, we operate for the majority of the time very much within the context of our perceptions and our interaction with reality, and that's where compassion is key. If we practice the teachings on the loving kindness, compassion, equanimity, sympathetic joy, what we call the four boundless, and we mingle that with also the practice of the six paramitas: generosity, discipline, patience, energy, meditation, and wisdom. If we mix these with our engagement with the world in our everyday life, then that is immensely powerful. And we can then, through practice of meditation, through study of the teaching, we can then gradually also expand our understanding of the nature of reality. So in this way, the relative bodhicitta is seen to be something that we really want to focus on and really want to establish firmly. And of course, we should continually cultivate this absolute insight. But we really very much operate in the beginning with this understanding of our world and our everyday life, and the necessity to integrate this wider, more magnanimous, courageous attitude, this compassionate attitude. So, so presently then, in our study, then we are here. I've been wanting to go through the. Oh, sorry, there's a question here. So, do the paramitas open us to the wider view that our senses and motions hide from us? Yes. See, this wider perspective, this wider view, what we generally call vipassana, and which is a more insightful understanding of our reality. It's a less confused understanding of reality, and it is what ultimately will set us free. This wider perspective is something that comes with greater love, with greater embracing of the world at large. And we can work through it on this from the point of view of our actions and our attitudes and our dualistic mindset. This is what we call skillful means, that we're not just saying, oh, it's all just emptiness, and then you got to meditate until you realize emptiness. That's impossible, practically speaking. So we want to engage. Well, we do have some we call that are instantaneous realizers. So there's a few in the history of Buddhism that have been like that. But we generally operate with an understanding of our reality and how we understand our world. And that's the beauty of the Buddhist teaching, and of course also in many other teachings. It's that we skillfully integrate this relative reality, and that's what we call skillful means. So the paramitas are the skillful means aspect of the bodhisattva path. And we could say the wisdom of vipassana, the insight into shunyata, that is the wisdom aspect. And the skillful means aspect is then the 6 paramitas. So with these paramitas, they do open us to a greater understanding of our reality. And just Khenpo Chögying Dorje, he was here teaching, and he went into some detail about how the Tibetan term for relative truth is kunzob, which some translators actually also translate like that. It means relative truth. It's the term that we normally translate as relative truth. But it actually means veiling everything or concealing everything. We don't actually see straight. We don't see properly. So practicing either from the point of view of the skillful means of the paramitas, or practicing from the point of view of wisdom, or uniting the two together, obviously, that enables us to see the world in a greater way, more accurately. If you're an academic, you might appreciate the term epistemic capacity, that you're simply your apparatus for observing things are greatly enhanced. Your ability to see phenomena around us, and also see the nature of our emotions, to see that clearer, that's greatly enhanced when we practice the paramitas, and of course the wisdom. So either way. Okay, so Khyentse Rinpoche in this context, he's been looking at what it is that we actually designate as solid phenomena in terms of ourselves and in terms of the world around us. So we looked at what we see ourselves as. When we think of ourselves as an ego, then we have this sense of me, and that's caught up with really 3 dimensions, which is our physicality, our body, and then our energetic and also verbal dimension, the unseen but yet very palpably real, and then also the mind. So we looked at the body, how it's a composition of various changing factors where we cannot find an essence. Then, in addition to that, then we have this notion of our mind, and also that is something, if we analyze, if we go down to to the minutest aspect of our body, we'll see that there's nothing that we can find there. And with all these conditions of our body, they're always changing. And similarly also the mind. So with these conditions that always change, understanding that both our body and our mind are conditional, we can see they don't possess any ultimate reality. Now we're going to look at the name. You know, we're strangely attached to our name. The sort of sense of, there's me, right? And my reputation, my credentials, the things that constitute me. And he says, this analysis that we can apply. And in general, by the way, with this notion of analysis in Mahayana Buddhism, we say there's nothing that can withstand analysis. So our ordinary reality, that is what it is. We have to shop, we call each other different names and so on. But once we begin to analyze, once you sit there and have the long, meaningful discussions, that's when you're applying analysis. Note that. And that's when, once you begin to use the W words, why, what, where, and so on, that's where we begin to analyze. Notice that one thing is to just leave things as they are, and that's, easy. That's what we need to do basically in practical terms. But when we begin to analyze, that's where things begin to dissolve, because that's where we, first of all, begin to see complexity. Let's say we're discussing a shared object, politician, or good music, or what constitutes good taste. How would you want to do things? You're discussing this with your friend. And of course, when you're discussing this with your friend, you'll see that there's a complexity that you could see it from things from so many different angles, right? And that's where you realize that the object, or if you're a Buddhist, you take it a bit further. Actually, a friend of mine just the other day, he was saying how in science, you understand that things can be broken down, analyzed, and don't possess essence, but you don't actually take that insight further. And that is such an important thing, and that's what we do in Buddhism. We take that insight into the composite, the conditional nature of phenomena, and the understanding that things are understood relative to where you're coming from. That's a very important point, because that enables us to understand that the object that we're talking about doesn't have its own intrinsic value. It's based on where we're coming from that we attribute some role or label or significance. Okay? So this practice of analysis is what brings us actually to what we call absolute truth. It's when we analyze, we begin to penetrate our assumptions about reality. And that's also why we have this image of the sword of Manjushri, that cuts through these deceptive labels. So it's not that the sword of Manjushri is a weapon, Khenpo Dojo was teaching on Manjushri the other night. Any of you who tried to log on might have had some difficulties, or some might, because I actually started the wrong webinar. Really sorry about that. But there was a couple of us who organized the webinar, so we had sort of double booked. So I clicked on I bought the wrong button, basically. Anyway, the recording will be up on the website. But Chögyam Dorje was talking about the sword of Manjushri is not something about, hammering people we don't like or something. It's about the sharpness that sees through deception. It's about, we say people are sharp, meaning they're not easily deceived. And so this quality of analysis is to see through appearances. So that's where we begin to, you could say, peel away deceptions. It doesn't mean that phenomena don't operate in the way they conventionally do, but it's that we begin to see in a greater way. So it doesn't prevent us from having the insights, or rather, it doesn't prevent us from appreciating phenomena. It actually enables us to appreciate phenomena more. But we're just not deceived by our particular, attitudes and attachments and aversions and all the things that essentially make us censor, filter reality. So this practice of analysis then we apply to the body, we apply to the to the mind, and now we're going to apply it to the name. Khyentse Rinpoche says, referring to this practice of identifying how the mind is merely just it's something that's insubstantial. So he says the same is true for the notion of name. For instance, we say person to designate a human being. The word person is just a collection of letters, P, E, R, S, and so on. But if we separate the P, E, R, the S, the O, and the N, the idea of person or human being completely disappears. Yeah, that's just a word we have, you know. So these are just labels. Once this system of false imputations has taken root, we go on to consider some beings and things to be ours, our relatives and friends who are so kind to us and to whom we feel strongly attached. We cannot bear to be separated from them for even a moment. We're ready to do any kind of action, positive or negative, to please or defend them. This is called attachment or desire. Now, when we're analyzing this, we're not going to put an end to love. We're not going to put an end to caring for our relatives and friends. But we're identifying that our fixating on, I like these people, but I don't like those others, and those I don't really care about, this sort of narrowing down where we are attached to and where we don't really perceive things in terms of how they are, but we perceive them in terms of their relationship to me. That's not necessarily love. That's not necessarily compassion. That's a smaller kind of, you could say, exercise of our insecure ego that actually wishes to have something that can consolidate, confirm our existence. And that's what attachment and desire is. So the sage is not someone who is unfeeling and not loving towards relatives and friends, but it's also somebody who who is caring for beings, but in a much wider and greater way, caring for all sentient beings ultimately, and in general just having a more courageous and wider perspective. The effect really is that a bodhisattva can care more effectively for those that they have connections with, their relatives, friends, and whoever they're connected with. But that is due to the seeing through this narrow construct of attachment and desire. Khyentse Rinpoche, so that's about attachment. There are other beings whom we somehow perceive as causing us harm, and we decide that they are our enemies. We're ready to harm them in return as much as we can. This is called aversion or hatred. And that again is sort of no longer seeing things for what they are, but rather just reacting on the basis of our particular perception. When the ignorance from which attachment and aversion pervades the whole mind, so we have a basic sense of just me that's alien from the other and that just sits with this insecure wishing to consolidate myself. When that is when the mind is pervaded by that, this is basically the ground of attachment aversion. Khyentse Rinpoche says, then the cause is present for wandering endlessly in samsara. So when we have this attachment and aversion, we are ready to just continue endlessly in confusion. In fact, attachment and aversion are just failure to recognize that enemy and friend are fleeting and highly unreliable concepts. We have been born countless times in samsara. In each of our births, we had parents, friends, and enemies. There is no certainty at all who might have been our parents, friends, and enemies in our past lives, or who will be so in our future lives to come. Our greatest enemies in this life might be our children in the next. So, who we're connected with as enemies and friends, relative parents, and so on, in the present life are of course due to particular conditions that have preceded this lifetime. But then again, conditions will change. And in our future life, we might be born as children of people who are not our parents in this life, who might even paradoxically be our enemies. We very often have very strong concepts that our enemies occupy our mind in a strong way, which actually would somehow link us up with them, even though it's not necessarily out of attachment, but in some way, strangely being strongly linked with these persons that we so strongly dislike, then we actually have a strong link. So they could very well become our parents in our next life. Our parents in this life might be our enemies in the next. By the way, that's just to say that anything could happen. So it doesn't mean that you necessarily will be born one way or another. And in general, we say it's impossible to understand karma. The Buddha, he says in one sutra, unless you're enlightened, don't speculate about how the karmic conditions play out. But one thing is certain, and that is that karmic conditions do operate. It's hard when you're not enlightened to understand it, how the particular details, but the way that they operate, that we are continually connecting with countless sentient beings, and they have been and will be related to us in as long as there is time. So in that sense, then we are absolutely no certain about who's really our enemy and who's our friend. Our parents in this life might be our enemies in the next, Khyentse Rinpoche says. We have been through innumerable lives, not just a few. Through our string of lives, we've had so many different parents, not always the same ones in each lifetime. And there's sort of a, Hollywood version of understanding reincarnation. I don't know, I've seen it in Hollywood movies. And occasionally somebody comes up with this, saying, if there's reincarnation, then how come there's more people now than there were before? Now, we understand that sentient beings are countless. Just within this hillside that I'm sitting on here, there's infinite beings. And the human race is just a very small section of all the infinite sentient beings. So just like you might have, anthills might increase and again decrease and so on, then also the number of humans on this planet obviously can come and go. So don't be caught up on that particular confused argument. But and Khyentse Rinpoche says, there is not a single sentient being in this universe who has not been our father or mother at some time or another. So we have had countless lifetimes, and we've had countless parents. He says, it is senseless, therefore, to have strong aversion or attachment to any of them, to consider them as enemies or friends. We only do so because we're utterly deluded and lack the ability to see how we have been related to other beings in countless past lives. When we see somebody and think, he is my enemy, that thought is simply a projection of the mind. If someone were to call us a thief, or perhaps even attack us with a stick, anger might suddenly well up in our minds. We might go red in the face and think, I must fight back and hit him even harder than he hit me. So we pick up a bigger stick and rush at him. Our anger might be so violent as to lead us to such extremes. But if we look at the anger itself, it's just a thought. If we look at the thought, there is really nothing to it. It has no shape, no color, location, or any other characteristic. It is empty. To recognize the empty nature of mind is absolute bodhicitta. So this analysis that we apply is not just a philosophical sort of exercise, but it's really essential for us to see through deception, how we not only fool ourselves, but it's also we create more suffering for ourselves as long as we get stuck on these projections. So this label then, that somebody is an enemy or somebody that we dislike, is something that is entirely an idea. It only exists in our as an idea. And as long as we sustain that idea, then of course it becomes a reality for us. A person is dislikable for this and that reason. But the person itself, like Shantideva, he says in the 6th chapter, the person, him or herself, is not responsible. That's just how they might be acting with their body, speech, and mind is entirely a product of their confusion. So the real enemy is not their particular style of acting, but it's the ignorance behind it. And so Shantideva, he says, when we get angry at somebody, if they hit us with a stick, we don't get angry at the stick. If somebody hits us with a baseball bat or whatever, or threatens us with something, we don't get angry at the object they're holding. We get angry at the person because we know it's the person behind that's driving this stick. And similarly also, we should understand that what it is that drives these sentient beings to do the things that they do is in fact their ignorance. They themselves are just caught up in a delusional attitude. So this is where this analysis that sees through our deceptive constructs, this has an enormous impact, both in terms of understanding the nature of reality and also on a very immediate, practical level. It prevents us from getting caught into patterns that create more suffering. So there's a question here. I often wonder why our view has become so limited. As a biologist, I feel it may have been the best survival option to deal with conditions in our human evolutionary history. It may be obsolete in our current circumstances, and certainly it seems to be a destructive source of much suffering. So yes, universally, regardless of whether we sort of subscribe to the Darwinian notion of evolution or not, which actually, is perfectly fine with the Buddhists, but the notion of survival as it comes up in a Buddhist context, when we're talking about self, that is not really seen as survival, that's rather seen as a destructive mechanism. So we don't really survive that well through this limitation that comes with a sense of me battling circumstances. So that's where there's a little bit probably, we risk that we misunderstand each other when we sort of, when we're talking between the Darwinistic notion of evolution and survival and so on, and the Buddhist perspective. But it certainly applies that this basic instinct of me, that is what drives so much suffering. And yes, we do in the present, you could say, context of our more analytically less parochial, I guess you could say, greater developed science, then we could very well begin to analyze some of these notions. Anyway, it sounds like the flight or fight reptilian brain that gets us into trouble. It's not subdued by our capacity to reason and be to get us into trouble if it's not subdued by our capacity to reason and be altruistic. Yes, that's a very, this freeze, what is it? Freeze, flight, fight, or freeze, right? Yeah. So all of that comes down to this confusion of self. And from the Buddhist point of view, we're not trying to become better persons in the sense of change the narrative, but from the absolute bodhicitta point of view, we are trying to change the narrative from the point of view of mind training, relative bodhicitta actually. But from absolute bodhicitta, we're actually seeing through the basic premise that is a delusional condition. So, yeah. Anyway, thank you for the feedback. I have a question in the context of ngöndro. Why Rinpoche recommends us to do ngöndro step by step, each practice at a time? Is that only for first-time practitioners of the ngöndro? That's not only Rinpoche, but that's sort of generally how it's traditionally done in in Buddhism. It's what we call gradual path. It's really that the preceding steps of the ngöndro enables us to do the following step even better. So, for example, taking refuge provides the foundation for the whole path, and then you could say on the basis of that, then the nature of the path is directed in a particular way through the development of bodhicitta. And then we have the purification of confusion through vajrasattva, the accumulation of merit, and that then takes us, when we've completed this accumulation and purification and so on, then we arrive at a very special place, which is then the practice of Guru Yoga. So basically the preceding steps in the ngöndro prepares us for the Guru Yoga. You could almost say Guru Yoga is yet an even more profound level. We have the outer, and we have the inner ngöndro. We could even say the Guru Yoga is like a third dimension, which is immensely profound. So it's really to prepare us gradually. Refuge prepares us for bodhicitta, bodhicitta prepares us for vajrasattva, and so on. Okay, Khyentse Rinpoche then says, if we reflect carefully, we can see that there is not the slightest reason to be angry when someone hits us. It would be ridiculous to be angry with the stick itself. Here Rinpoche comes with that. The example. It would be ridiculous to be angry with the stick itself, but it is even more ridiculous to be angry with the person who hits us. He is a victim of his own mental poisons and deserves all our compassion for all the extra suffering he's building up for himself by acting in such a way. How could we be angry with a sick person whose mind is so disturbed? We must rid our minds completely of exaggerated attachments and aversions. If we have hitherto considered certain people as our enemies, we should now wish to benefit them as much as we can. If we have been strongly attached to some people, we can continue to benefit them, but we need not to be caught up in our attachment. We must make our feelings of love and compassion equal for all beings. So this is not a question of minimizing. This is not a question of taking, we have this much love, right? And then if we spread it out to all sentient beings, we're going to have a very thin, weak tea, a very bland, minimal love that we sort of stretch out. That's not the point. It's the contrary. When there's no longer this caught up in our likes and aversions, then the mind has a far greater capacity that extends regardless of the connections to all sentient beings. That it's infinite. So we aspire. Of course, this is not something we can do overnight, but that is the scope of this is the nature of the path. So this is not a moralistic thing that you should love everybody right away. Sort of, I mean, great if you could do that. And of course, we could kind of say, okay, I'll, fake it till I make it. But it's really about changing something from within. It's not about behavior. It's not about external gestures. It's about changing the attitude, the mind within, seeing through the deception, the confusion, and then cultivating a wider perspective and a greater understanding, and on the basis of that, greater sympathy, appreciation, compassion, and so forth. So, Khyentse Rinpoche says, there is no enemy to fight. There are no friends to hang on to. All beings deserve the same love and kindness from us as our parents in this present life. So we should understand that our particular way of seeing persons, whether we like or dislike them, that has something to do with our present connections. And of course, among our connections, the most significant one in general would be our parents, or persons who have really cared for us completely selflessly. And even if we haven't experienced that, we could see this is something that happens. It happens in the human realm, it happens in nature, and so forth. And so with that understanding of such kindness exists, he says we should reflect on how grateful we ought to be to our parents, meaning all sentient beings, that at one time or another have cared for us entirely selflessly. First of all, Rinpoche says, they gave us life. Then from our earliest years, they fed us, dressed us, educated us, and loved us. We should extend this feeling of gratitude to all the infinity of sentient beings. The mutual love between parents and children is something very natural. Even a very fierce animal like a tigress has great love for her cubs. She's ready at any moment to give her life to save them. But this sort of love is very one-sided, limited to only a few beings. We should feel it for all sentient beings. So the tigress's compassion, of course, is something that has to do with her connection with these cubs. She might kill another animal without any kind of concern. And so this kind of partiality, that's where we can see love can be limited. What the sage's love is something that extends to all living beings without filtering, according to our likes and dislikes, labeled then as friend and enemy. Khyentse Rinpoche says, there is nowhere in samsara which is beyond suffering. All sentient beings, without exception, even the tiniest insect, want only to be happy. Yet, all they do is to perpetuate their own suffering. The reason for this is that they do not recognize negative actions as the cause of suffering and positive actions as the cause of happiness. Animals, out of their desire to be comfortable and contented, kill other animals for food. By this, they create further suffering, both for themselves and for the other animals. So this doesn't mean that we should say, well, isn't it natural for animals to kill? Of course, it is natural. And in fact, it's natural for all sentient beings in samsara to be perpetuating these causes of suffering. But it doesn't mean, just because it's natural, because everybody's doing it, that it's something that necessarily will bring happiness. The natural instinct is based on the delusion of self-centering. And so as long as there's self-centering, then there's going to be perpetuating suffering. So samsara as such is a place of suffering. So the experience of samsara is something that our heart goes out to all these beings that are innocent and yet in their confusion generate suffering upon suffering. Khyentse Rinpoche says, a madman who sticks a knife into his body or who runs around naked in winter is basically somebody who wants to be happy, but unwittingly. He does all sorts of things that bring him suffering. In this way, sentient beings cause their own suffering by failing to recognize that the only way to achieve happiness is to increase their positive actions and to give up all their negative ones. So again, this comes down to not about what we're doing. It's not about all of a sudden we should begin to talk sweet, sugary nothings. It's not about that we should begin to behave in a contrived, artificial way, but it's from the bottom of our heart that we begin to have this wishing others happiness and caring for them being free from suffering, and also being intelligent in handling ourselves, understanding the attitudes that bring our own happiness and the attitudes that bring upon ourselves our own suffering. Of course, this will also be reflected in the body and the speech, but the main place is from within the mind itself. So, understanding how sentient beings bring on their own suffering, then Khyentse Rinpoche says, when we reflect on this, we will begin to feel an intense compassion for all beings caught in delusion. To have compassion for all sentient beings, however, is still not enough. Compassion alone cannot help. We have to put it into practice and really help sentient beings. Someone who has done well in life and takes care of his parents in their old age is respected by everyone. But if he neglects his parents, people will despise him. How much more despicable is it to fail to help all the infinite beings who have been our loving parents throughout our countless lives? We must be determined to do whatever will benefit them. So some of these ideas, of course, are not ideas that we were brought up with. This is not something we were taught in school. In fact, so many of the ideas that we were taught in school are ideas that are profoundly flawed. And so we very often have developed a muscle to debate. Like when Khyentse Rinpoche says something like, then we might say, yeah, that's good, but, I think this, I think that, rather than actually think about what Khyentse Rinpoche is saying. And so it's really important that when we come across ideas that are not according to the way that we were taught in school, or the way that people in general think about things, the way that we interact with others, wishing to benefit every sentient being, is not something that is normally sort of part of how people discuss things. And so we very often will say, whoa, hold on, this is not possible. Rather, when we're listening to the teachings, we should just take it in and with ourselves, without verbalizing, and just think, is this really true? Is this a constructive way of thinking about things? Oh yes, that probably could possibly, we might arrive at seeing the genius in this. But it's important, before we sort of begin to right away sort of react to what we hear, that we really let the teaching settle in and reflect quietly. We don't even need to engage discussion, but just quietly let these ideas permeate ourselves. So, being determined then to attend to all sentient beings who have been our parents in countless lives, we then have this determination to benefit them. Khyentse Rinpoche goes on to say, if we set out to benefit others, giving them food, clothes, and ordinary affection, we'll just help them to some extent. But the benefit is limited and only temporary. We have to find a way to bring them absolute and unchanging benefit. This is something that ordinary acts of kindness to family and friends cannot do. Only the Dharma can do that. The Dharma can help sentient beings to escape from the lower states of samsara and ultimately to achieve enlightenment. Of course, in the beginning, in our present state, we do not have the same ability to help others, as have the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, such as Manjushri and Avalokiteshvara. The very reason for practicing the Dharma is to achieve such ability. This is why we need to follow a spiritual master, to receive his teachings and put them into practice. So the nature of Dharma is the science of reality. And this reality spans all the physical reality and the mind. This is where the Buddha is the awakened one, the one who understands reality. This reality can never be known through observing external phenomena and being able to make little gadgets that might be interesting. This kind of Dharma comes from working with the mind within and dispelling all delusion. But once there is the awakening, then this insight into the nature of reality, that is the foundation then of what the Buddha teaches. And that is what we call the Dharma. And this Dharma understands the nature of reality and what it is that drives the suffering, what it is that brings about liberation. And even without complete perfect enlightenment, then great Buddhas and Bodhisattvas like Manjushri and Avalokiteshvara, they have enormous capacity to benefit others. Of course, we might not have the ability to perceive such great beings or have the merit and so forth, but at the same time, we actually have an intuitive understanding what is genuine selfless compassion and what is genuine wisdom and so forth. So we can visualize and understand and appreciate what it is that Manjushri and Avalokiteshvara, they represent. So we're talking about some human or sentient qualities that have not so much, they're not only about the behavior and the physical and the verbal actions, but they're about a courage, a magnanimity, a greatness that is invisible, that abides within the person, and a magnanimity that is exceptional. And so for us to engage in the path, it's not enough that we read some books or we sign up in the local Buddhist church or whatever, Buddhist group, but there has to be and a connection to somebody that embodies the path. And this person is the one that gives us an idea of what we want to be. Basically, we don't really see the spiritual teacher as somebody who's there in our lives as some sort of authority or somebody who's like our schoolmaster. It's just simply the person that shows us sanity. And so we're basically just emulating their example, doing what they're doing. So this is not about just learning a set of practices. This is really about gauging a quality of greatness, a quality that is invisible, and yet it's something that we can perceive and sense and appreciate. And that living connection to a living master is so essential in order for us to really understand how to apply this practice of compassion. Khyentse Rinpoche says, anyone can attain Buddhahood, even an insect, if they make the effort and have enough confidence and devotion. So it means our confusion is something that is not basic to us. It's removable. We can, of course, ego, of course, would like to keep on making a drama out of our confusion. And that's the way that ego sustains itself. But if there arrives the point where we can see this is very unhelpful, and this is essentially what drives suffering, then we wish to eliminate this confusion. And that's where we understand that, and where the premise of the Buddhist path is that the ego, because it's non-existent to begin with, is removable. Our delusion is removable. It just requires that we provide the right conditions. And that's where he says effort, confidence, devotion, and so forth. He says we should begin, first of all, by being resolutely confident that we can attain enlightenment. We need also to have a vast, courageous mind, thinking that we will be able to bring all sentient beings to enlightenment as well. It is a very limited attitude to think simply, may I be rid of my difficulties, be protected from fears, and be happy and comfortable, and only care about oneself. We should wish unlimited happiness for the unlimited number of beings. So there we can see the difference between the attitude of an ordinary sentient being, which is, I really would like to be happy and comfortable, and the attitude of the sage, which is really just looking at sentient beings and wishing them happiness. The only way to fulfill this wish for the happiness of all sentient beings, the unlimited number of beings, Khyentse Rinpoche says, the only way to fulfill this wish is to practice the Dharma and attain enlightenment. Which maybe sounds narrow in terms of, oh yeah, then I should be a Buddhist and I should do Buddhist things. Dharma should be understood as aligning ourselves with the natural condition of reality. And it's through the practice of aligning ourselves with this reality, letting go of the confused practices that is non-Dharma, that we then begin to penetrate confusion, and confusion falls away in this abiding condition, which is what we call Buddha nature, or the seed of bliss and so forth, that this becomes manifest. Khyentse Rinpoche says, if from the very beginning you dedicate your efforts to the welfare of all beings, your practice will be immune to negative influences such as anger and pride. Moreover, its benefit will endure from now until we reach enlightenment. So this is, in a nutshell, really the motivation of bodhicitta. Okay. Does a bodhisattva feel sadness that stimulates compassion? This seems to be a strong emotion, but immensely beneficial. Yeah, Chögyam Trungpa, he talked about the genuine heart of sadness, and Tsongsa Khyentse Rinpoche has been using that term a lot. And it's the quality of being raw. The bodhisattva is not afraid to be raw. The bodhisattva is the ultimate bleeding heart. The bodhisattva is not about, oh, I have to protect my heart. The Bodhisattva doesn't need to protect the heart, and as a result, the Bodhisattva's heart is continually, you could say, hurt, continually hit by the suffering of sentient beings. We say that the difference between a sage and an ordinary being in terms of perceiving suffering is a bit like the difference between when we have a hair. If you put a hair in the palm of our hand, sort of we can maybe slightly sense it's there, but we don't really pay much attention. If we put the hair in our eye, we have it's very irritating. So similarly, we really feel it strongly. So similarly, the Bodhisattva's perception of the suffering of sentient beings is like the hair in the eye. Ours, we're very insensitive. So the Bodhisattva is one that feels suffering beyond anything, and for that reason also is determined that something must be done. So the Bodhisattva ventures into the world manifesting compassion, strength, wisdom from that point of view of being so aware of the suffering of sentient beings. So the condition of the Bodhisattva very much operates with this raw sensitivity and profound sadness about the suffering of samsara. But the thing is, the Bodhisattva is not overwhelmed. The Bodhisattva is driven to do something about it. If we are trying to do all to achieve happiness, is that not reinforcing yet another form of craving? Not really, because craving is about self-centering, and the bodhicitta that we're talking about here, that's not about craving. It's about relinquishing craving. See, happiness is tripped up when we crave. When we crave, then we say it's like drinking salt water. It never actually, when we get what we want, it never actually makes us happy. In fact, it makes us more and more difficult. We become more and more fussy. We become less and less satisfied, and so we need more and more. So the path of achieving happiness is relinquishing that. So it's in fact the very opposite. Can you please advise which website the recordings of these webinars are available on? Many thanks. Yeah, when you got the link for this, then also in that mail there's a link to the Dropbox archive where we store all the recordings from these webinars. So in case you don't have that mail, people delete their mail, so you might not have it, then just send me a mail, and I'll send it to you. Okay? If there's anybody who for some reason doesn't have my email, it is okay, I guess that's enough for today. Okay. Thank you. Oh, through this virtue, may all beings throughout existence awaken together without a single being left behind. In the pure realm of the luminous essence, the ground of the great perfection, may they remain inseparable from the kayas and wisdoms. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together.